Chapter 4 of Tales of Troy. Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales of Troy. Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities by Andrew Lang. The Stealing of Helen, Part 1. This happy time did not last long, and Telemachus was still a baby when war arose, so great and mighty and marvellous as had never been known in the world. Far across the sea that lies on the east of Greece, there dwelt the rich King Priam. His town was called Troy or Ilios, and it stood on a hill near the seashore, where are the Straits of Hellespont between Europe and Asia. It was a great city surrounded by strong walls, and its ruins are still standing. The kings could make merchants who passed through the straits pay toll to them, and they had allies in Thrace, a part of Europe opposite Troy, and Priam was chief of all princes on his side of the sea, as Agamemnon was chief king in Greece. Priam had many beautiful things. He had a vine made of gold, with golden leaves and clusters, and he had the swiftest horses, and many strong and brave sons. The strongest and bravest was named Hector, and the youngest and most beautiful was named Paris. There was a prophecy that Priam's wife would give birth to a burning torch, so when Paris was born, Priam sent a servant to carry the baby into a wild wood on Mount Ida, and leave him to die or be eaten by wolves and wild cats. The servant left the child, but the shepherd found him, and brought him up as his own son. The boy became as beautiful for a boy as Helen was for a girl, and was the best runner and hunter and archer among the country people. He was loved by the beautiful Oenone, a nymph, that is a kind of fairy, who dwelt in a cave among the woods of Ida. The Greeks and Trojans believed in those days that such fair nymphs haunted all beautiful woodland places, and the mountains and wells, and had crystal palaces like mermaids beneath the waves of the sea. These fairies were not mischievous, but gentle and kind. Sometimes they married mortal men, and Oenone was the bride of Paris, and hoped to keep him for her own all the days of his life. It was believed that she had the magical power of healing wounded men, however sorely they were hurt. Paris and Oenone lived most happily together in the forest, but one day when the servants of Priam had driven off a beautiful bull that was in the herd of Paris, he left the hills to seek it, and came into the town of Troy. His mother Hecuba saw him, and looking at him closely perceived that he wore a ring which she had tied around her baby's neck when he was taken away from her soon after his birth. Then Hecuba, beholding him so beautiful, and knowing him to be her son, wept for joy. And they all forgot the prophecy that he would be a burning torch of fire, and Priam gave him a house like those of his brothers, the Trojan princes. The fame of beautiful Helen reached Troy, and Paris quite forgot unhappy Oenone, and must needs go to see Helen for himself. Perhaps he meant to try to win her for his wife before her marriage. But sailing was little understood in these times, and the water was wide, and men were often driven for years out of their course, to Egypt and Africa, and far away into the unknown seas where fairies lived in enchanted islands, and cannibals dwelt in caves of the hills. Paris came much too late to have a chance of marrying Helen. However, he was determined to see her, and he made his way to her palace beneath the mountain Taygetus, beside the clear swift river Eurotas. The servants came out of the hall when they heard the sound of wheels and horses' feet, and some of them took the horses to the stables and tilted the chariots against the gateway, while others led Paris into the hall, which shone like the sun with gold and silver. Then Paris and his companions were led to the baths, where they were bathed and clad in new clothes, mantles of white and robes of purple, And next they were brought before King Menelaus, and he welcomed them kindly, and meat was set before them, and wine in cups of gold. While they were talking, Helen came forth from her fragrant chamber like a goddess, her maidens following her, and carrying for her an ivory distaff with violet-coloured wool, which she span as she sat, and heard Paris tell how far he had travelled to see her who was so famous for her beauty, even in countries far away. Then Paris knew that he had never seen and never could see a lady so lovely and gracious as Helen, as she sat and span, while the red drops fell and vanished from the ruby called the Star, and Helen knew that among all the princes in the world there was none as beautiful as Paris. Now some say that Paris, by art magic, put on the appearance of Menelaus, and asked Helen to come sailing with him, and that she, thinking he was her husband, followed him, and he carried her across the wide waters of Troy, away from her lord and her one beautiful little daughter, the child Hermione. And others say that the gods carried Helen herself off to Egypt, and that they made in her likeness a beautiful ghost out of flowers and sunset clouds, whom Paris bore to Troy. And this they did to cause war between Greeks and Trojans. Another story is that Helen and her bower maid and her jewels were seized by force when Menelaus was out hunting. It is only certain that Paris and Helen did cross the seas together, and that Menelaus and little Hermione were left alone in the melancholy palace beside the Eurotas. Penelope, we know for certain, made no excuses for her beautiful cousin, but hated her as the cause of her own sorrows and of the death of thousands of men in war, for all the Greek princes were bound by their oath to fight for Menelaus against anyone who injured him and stole his wife away. But Helen was very unhappy in Troy, and blamed herself as bitterly as all the other women blamed her, and most of all Oenone, who had been the love of Paris. The men were much more kind to Helen, and were determined to fight to the death rather than lose the sight of her beauty among them. The news of the dishonour done to Menelaus and to all the princes of Greece ran through the country like fire through a forest. East and west and south and north went the news, to kings in their castles on the hills, and beside the rivers, and on cliffs above the sea. The cry came to ancient Nestor of the white beard at Pylos, Nestor who had reigned over 2 generations of men, who had fought against the wild folk of the hills, and remembered the strong Heracles, and Eurytus of the black bow that sang before the day of battle. The cry came to black-bearded Agamemnon in his strong town called Golden Mycenae, because it was so rich. It came to the people of Thisbe, where the wild doves haunt. And it came to rocky Pytho, where is the sacred temple of Apollo, and the maid who prophesies. It came to Aias, the tallest and strongest of men, in his little isle of Salamis, and to Diomede of the loud war-cry, the bravest of warriors, who held Argos and tyrants of the black walls of huge stones, that are still standing. The summons came to the western islands, and to Ulysses in Ithaca, and even far south to the great island of Crete of the 100 cities, where Idomeneus ruled in Knossos. Idomeneus, whose ruined palace may still be seen with the throne of the king, and pictures painted on the walls, and the king's own draught-board of gold and silver, and hundreds of tablets of clay, on which are written the lists of royal treasures. Far north went the news to Pelagian Argos, and Hellas, where the people of Peleus dwelt, the Myrmidons. But Peleus was too old to fight, and his boy Achilles dwelt far away, in the island of Scyros, dressed as a girl, among the daughters of King Lycomedes. To many another town, and to 100 islands went the bitter news of approaching war, for all princes knew that their honour and their oaths compelled them to gather their spearmen and bowmen and slingers from the fields and the fishing, and to make ready their ships, and meet King Agamemnon in the harbour of Aulis, and cross the wide sea to besiege Troy town. Now the story is told that Ulysses was very unwilling to leave his island and his wife Penelope and the little Telemachus, while Penelope had no wish that he should pass into danger, and into the sight of Helen of the fair hands. So it is said that when two of the princes came to summon Ulysses, he pretended to be mad, and went ploughing the sea sand with oxen, and sowing the sand with salt. Then the prince Palamedes took the baby Telemachus from the arms of his nurse Eurycleia, and laid him in the line of the furrow, where the ploughshare would strike him and kill him. But Ulysses turned the plough aside, and they cried that he was not mad but sane, and he must keep his oath, and join the fleet at Aulis, a long voyage for him to sail, round the stormy southern cape of Malaya. Whether this tale be true or not, Ulysses did go, leading 12 black ships, with high beaks painted red at prow and stern. The ships had oars, and the warriors manned the oars to row when there was no wind. There was a small raised deck at each end of the ships. On these decks men stood to fight with sword and spear when there was a battle at sea. Each ship had but one mast, with a broad lugger sail, and for anchors they had only heavy stones attached to cables. They generally landed at night and slept on the shore on one of the many islands, when they could, for they greatly feared to sail out of sight of land. The fleet consisted of more than 1,000 ships, each with 50 warriors, so the army was of more than 50,000 men. Agamemnon had 100 ships, Diomede had 80, Nestor had 90, the Cretans with Idomeneus had 80, Menelaus had 60, but Aias and Ulysses, who lived in small islands, had only 12 ships apiece. Yet Aias was so brave and strong, and Ulysses so brave and wise, that they were ranked among the greatest chiefs and advisers of Agamemnon, with Menelaus, Diomede, Idomeneus, Nestor, Menestheus of Athens, and 2 or 3 others. These chiefs were called the Council, and gave advice to Agamemnon, who was commander-in-chief. He was a brave fighter, but so anxious and fearful of losing the lives of his soldiers that Ulysses and Diomede were often obliged to speak to him very severely. Agamemnon was also very insolent and greedy, though, when anyone stood up to him, he was ready to apologize, for fear the injured chief should renounce his service and take away his soldiers. Nestor was much respected because he remained brave, though he was too old to be very useful in battle. He generally tried to make peace when the princes quarrelled with Agamemnon. He loved to tell long stories about his great deeds when he was young, and he wished the chiefs to fight in old-fashioned ways. For instance, in his time the Greeks had fought in clan regiments, and the princely men had never dismounted in battle, but had fought in squadrons of chariots. But now the owners of chariots fought on foot, each man for himself, while his squire kept the chariot near him to escape on, if he had to retreat. Nestor wished to go back to the good old way of chariot charges against the crowds of foot soldiers of the enemy. In short, he was a fine example of the old-fashioned soldier. Aias, though so very tall, strong, and brave, was rather stupid. He seldom spoke, but he was always ready to fight, and the last to retreat. Menelaus was weak of body, but as brave as the best, or more brave, for he had a keen sense of honour, and would attempt what he had not the strength to do. Diomede and Ulysses were great friends, and always fought side by side when they could, and helped each other in the most dangerous adventures. These were the chiefs who led the great Greek armada from the harbour of Aulis. A long time had passed after the flight of Helen before the large fleet could be collected, and more time went by in the attempt to cross the sea to Troy. There were tempests that scattered the ships, so they were driven back to Aulis to refit, and they fought as they went out again with the peoples of unfriendly islands and besieged their towns. What they wanted most of all was to have Achilles with them, for he was the leader of 50 ships and 2,500 men, and he had a magical armour made, men said, for his father by Hephaestus, the god of armour-making and smithy work. End of chapter 4. The stealing of Helen, part 1.